Good afternoon to you, Mark Sutton with HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion for December the 23rd, 2015, the day before Christmas Eve. Hope you're having a great week. If you are east of the Rockies, it is very warm and in some cases very stormy. We're going to get into that. But first, as I like to do with these off-season editions of the discussion that I try to put out once a week at least, we take a look at some of the larger puzzle pieces that we look for when we're trying to assess what might happen in the upcoming hurricane season. Of course, we're talking 2016 hurricane season, and part of that is the sea surface temperature anomalies, the departures from normal, and this is the current snapshot just a couple of days ago released from the NOAA sea surface temperature anomaly site. And you can see the glaring El Nino here in the Pacific, right along the equatorial region here, but it is starting to sort of fade down a little bit. If you think of it as a very bright light, well, a couple of weeks ago it was shining at its brightest, and now it's starting to lose just a little bit of that luster, so to speak, and fade just ever so slightly, even though there are some high anomaly values right in here, close to 3 degrees Celsius. Overall, the El Nino and the atmosphere-ocean coupling that was supporting this strong event is starting to fade, and I'll show you some more evidence of that in just a moment. And the other part of the puzzle piece, of course, is the Atlantic Basin. This is what we call the main development region through here, and it's right at normal to slightly below normal in just a few patches. Doesn't really matter right now in December, but we'll certainly watch that as we get into 2016. Most of the long-range climate models develop a very warm tropical Atlantic, and they keep this warm signal in line as well. And you can see very warm ocean temperatures as compared to normal in the northwest Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico running above normal, as is much of the subtropical Atlantic. So, things are still holding pretty much where we expected them to be, and the next big piece of the puzzle will be to see the collapse of the El Nino actually take place, and part of that can be sort of tracked in the long paddock site here from the Queensland government site out of Australia, and they track what we call the SOI, or the Southern Oscillation Index, the pressure pattern across the tropical Pacific, and right now today's value is plus 6.8, but check out what's been happening here. We had a pretty substantial low value of negative 21 here in October, but the latest 90-day average is getting close to half that value at only minus 12. And these positive numbers that keep coming in, think of it as slowly hammering away at the wall, and the wall will eventually fall down, the rock, whatever, the tree, any analogy you want to think of, slowly chipping away at it, and eventually it'll collapse. And that's what's happening here. So these values will translate to stronger easterly winds across this area coming from the east, and that will begin to disrupt this warm ocean profile that we have in the Pacific. And lo and behold, the models are picking up on that, and there are other just amazing tools that we can track this with. And this is the very latest subsurface anomaly, whereas this shows us what it looks like looking down on the ocean. This is what it would look like if it was like a CAT scan, sort of a slice through the ocean, if you will. And you can clearly see a very large area of blue, which are cold anomalies on the left side of the scale here. This is the surface at the top, and this is about 250 meters deep or so in the midsection here. And this would be the eastern Pacific over on the right-hand side, and this would be the western Pacific roughly, and you can see that 100 degrees west longitude all the way out past 140 east longitude, so way out there, a big span of ocean, and then it's a slice through. And so you see the warm anomalies here at the top with the strongest in the eastern Pacific, but notice that this coloration here, there's really nothing there. It's right at neutral, or normal, where it should be. And this is going to gradually expand to the east. This cold water will eventually upwell and start eroding this away, and finally we'll see the whole thing beginning to collapse as we get into January, and the models are picking up on that pretty well. over the next few months, almost 100% chance of El Nino conditions in the tropical Pacific, the ENSO state as we call it, El Nino, but then a rapid decline from there in like the April, May, June time frame. El Nino only a little bit more than 70% chance, but then by the time we get to the early part of the summer, May, June, and July, the probability of neutral conditions setting in is getting close to 60%. We'll call it about 57% or so. But what's interesting, I think, the most here is if we look further out into time should be, the chances of La Nina, the cooling, abnormal cooling there, the blue, really start to increase, getting closer to 50% probability, but then of course the El Nino probability dropping well below 20%. And this time period here, ASO, that's August, September, October, the peak of the 2016 hurricane season, the probability of La Nina going up, and of course the probability of El Nino going down drastically in that time period. So there are some interesting clues that still remain intact for suggesting that next year's hurricane season should be busier than we've seen over the last three, 2013, 2014, and 2015. So we shall see what we shall see, right? The good thing is we can track this on a weekly and then a monthly basis, and we'll do that each time I would do one of these discussions. And just to show you sea surface temperatures, because of the lack of cold air coming off of North America, the Gulf Stream out here still very warm off the East Coast. Water temperatures close to 80 degrees in some locations, mid to upper 70s. And then along the shelf water, not too bad either, mid to upper 60s, which, you know, up in Long Island and parts of New England, that's the peak of the summer. People go swimming in that and they love it. They take what they can get. The Gulf of Mexico, still running very warm here in the Loop Current area and just south of the Florida Keys. Water temperatures at or above 80 degrees, as is the case here in parts of the Bay of Campeche. And then, of course, the shelf water being shallower, it cools off quicker, and the water temperatures, mid to upper 60s across much of the shelf water region, from the Florida Big Bend area all the way over to the coastal bend in Texas. Now, lower 48 weather is another topic that I cover on these off-season updates, looking for potential large outbreaks of severe weather, winter storms, things of that nature, very cold outbreaks, or very warm as it's been as of late. And you can see by the map here, the hazards map, lots of rain and moisture in the east, severe weather in parts of the Mississippi Valley, and then stormy on the cold side of things out west. If we look at a radar shot, a wonderful composite radar showing the entire nation. I really like this radar product from the Weather Service. Stormy out west for the most part, even though it doesn't show up well on radar. That stormy pattern will continue. High elevation snows in Washington and Oregon, they need it. Luckily, the snowpack in a good deal of the mountainous region out here in the Sierras and even parts of the Great Basin as a whole are running above where they normally would be. So that's really good for their water table situation. It's not a solution to the drought where everybody can cheer and start watering their lawns profusely, but it's looking pretty good. But from the El Nino perspective, bringing all that moisture in, a good sign for them for sure. You got to start somewhere. And as we slide over to the east, this is where things get interesting and even dangerous with some of this severe weather. Very warm, unstable air mass across the deep south. Moderate risk of severe weather in this region, which I'll show you in a moment. The potential for tornadoes, damaging wind, and hail increasing across this region and across parts of the Mississippi Valley area. And we can see that very clearly on the Storm Prediction Center's site. And let me see if I can zoom in on this graphic if it will let me. And I can show you, this really puts it in perspective. Just a neat way to see everything. The radar superimposed underneath. You have these different tornado watches in place. Moderate risk of severe weather over parts of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And then lower chances, but still not zero, surrounding that bullseye, if you will, extending as far north as Michigan, as far south as the Florida Panhandle and southern Louisiana, and then as far east as the Carolinas, and even up parts of the I-95 corridor. And if you're traveling, that's a big problem from there. So very, very active and warm in the east, active and cold out west. And if we go back to the Storm Prediction Center site, I want to show you the outlook here and how they look at things categorically. And we'll look at day one, as this is the most current situation, obviously. And we look at the different categories. The tornado threat highest here, again, in western Tennessee, parts of eastern Arkansas, northwest Mississippi. 15% overall. You say, well, that's not very high, but for December, this is a real serious situation. And because nightfall comes much sooner, this could be a real problem. And we haven't had any tornado deaths in over 200 days. We don't want that changing today. So stay alert. The wind threat, obviously, outside of tornadoes, you have straight line winds, downbursts. A little bit farther to the north, I've messed that up again. I guess that would be right. Far for distance. A little farther to the north into Kentucky and north central Tennessee. And then the hail core, literally the hail core area, the core of the strongest potential for hail. And then thunderstorms, there is such a thing as a hail core. Not too surprising that it would also be in the area where the strongest threat of tornadoes exists because of the development of potential supercells. And then, curiously here in parts of Illinois and extreme eastern Missouri, the chance of hail higher there too. So basically the bottom line, you got to pay attention to what's going on out there, NOAA weather radio, internet sources, you name it, because this region all through here is going to get very active later today in the Mississippi Valley and parts of the Tennessee, Kentucky, southern Indiana, Illinois, all the way down to the Gulf Coast. This could be a dangerous situation. And then there's I-95 right there for folks traveling up that corridor. Heavy rain, slow it down, take your time. You want to arrive to Grandma's house. It's not going to be any kind of wintry scene for the over the river and through the woods thought, but it's going to be wet, slippery, and a lot of people driving and in a hurry, and we want you to come back and watch these updates safely in the future, so be careful out there. All right, well, that's it from me for today. Have a great Christmas once it arrives. Warm, record-setting in the east for that. Out west, white Christmas in some of the high mountain areas, typical of this time of year, in a stormy pattern, cold. And then the pattern will probably start to shift as we get into January. We cannot continue the ridge in the east, trough in the west pattern for the entire winter. I guess it's mathematically possible, but not very likely. So we'll look at that as we get into the new year. All right, well, that is it for me for today and for the rest of the week. I will be back one day next week, not sure exactly when, but we'll make sure we knock out one of these updates at least once a week during the hurricane off season. And then next year, of course, these resume pretty much on a daily basis as needed. So, again, Merry Christmas to all. And I am Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. I'll talk to you again next week.